Story 1. The Craigslist Encounter. Isolation. It's a strange thing. When you first experience it, the quiet is almost comforting. A break from the chaos of the world. A place to breathe, but spend enough time alone. And that silence takes on a different tone. Every sound seems louder, every shadow feels darker, and every moment holds the potential for something to go terribly wrong. That was my life. 15 miles from the nearest city, surrounded by dense woods that swallowed sound and stretched endlessly in all directions. My nearest neighbors were a quarter of a mile away, which was just how I liked it. Isolation gave me the freedom to work on my cars, a lifelong obsession of mine. I bought old junkers, restored them, and sold them off, some on commission through my website and others through Craigslist ads. Craigslist was always hit or miss. The buyers ranged from genuine car enthusiasts to people who barely seemed to understand what they were looking at. But the income was steady, and for the most part, I didn't mind the occasional eccentric buyer. What I didn't realize was how much trouble one of those Craigslist transactions could bring into my life. It was a Tuesday afternoon when he showed up. I was in the garage, wiping grease from my hands, when I heard the crunch of tires on gravel. A van was rolling up my long dirt driveway, its engine sputtering and coughing like it was on its last legs. I stepped outside, squinting against the sun as the van came to a stop. The man who climbed out was tall, with a wiry frame and a face that seemed perpetually locked in a scowl. His clothes were dirty, his hair unkempt, and there was something about his eyes, sharp, darting around like he was sizing up the place. "Here for the ad," he said, his voice rough and low. "Yeah," I replied cautiously. He motioned toward the back of the van. When he swung the doors open, I was met with the sight of a car, or at least what was left of one. Rusted metal, missing windows, and a smell like wet earth and mildew. "This thing's not gonna run again," I said, inspecting it from a distance. "Figured," he said with a shrug. "How much?" "I'll give you 100 for scrap." The man's face darkened for a moment, but then he nodded. To my surprise, he handed me $50 instead. "Take it, just get rid of it," he muttered before climbing back into the van. As he pulled away, I noticed two other faces in the van, watching me from behind the windshield. I couldn't make out much detail, but something about them made my stomach twist. That night, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The man had seemed too eager to leave, like he couldn't get away fast enough. And the car? What was the story behind that wreck? I tried to distract myself by working. I spent hours in the garage, sorting through tools and appraising the car for salvageable parts. Most of it was junk, but the steel could be added to my scrap pile out back. By the time I called it a night, the wind had picked up outside. The trees swayed and groaned, their shadows dancing across my windows. I locked up the garage, double-checked the house doors, and climbed into bed, but sleep didn't come easily. It was sometime after midnight when I heard the first sound, a dull crash. Like something heavy had fallen. My eyes snapped open, my pulse quickening. The sound came again, louder this time, followed by the distinct creak of the garage door. Someone was in there. I grabbed the nearest thing I could use as a weapon, a crowbar, and crept toward the garage. The cold night air stung my skin as I stepped outside, my breath misting in the moonlight. The garage door hung slightly ajar, its padlock dangling uselessly from the latch. My heart pounded as I peered inside. The lights were still on, casting long, eerie shadows across the cluttered space. And there, among the mess, were three figures. The man from earlier was back, and he wasn't alone. His two companions were tearing through my garage like wild animals, overturning boxes and tossing tools aside. "Where is it?" one of them growled. "Check the drawers," another barked. I ducked behind a stack of tires, my grip on the crowbar tightening. My mind raced. They were looking for something, but what? "Hey," I heard something. One of them hissed. My breath caught as their flashlight swept the room. I pressed myself against the wall, willing myself to stay silent. The man with the flashlight moved closer, his boots crunching against the concrete floor. "Come out," he yelled, his voice echoing in the confined space. I felt trapped, my heart hammering so loudly I was sure they could hear it. Then, one of them muttered, "He's gotta have cash hidden here somewhere. Look for floorboards." Cash? They thought I had money stashed away. The realization sent a chill down my spine. These weren't just petty thieves, they were desperate, dangerous. As the man drew closer, I braced myself, raising the crowbar slightly. If he found me, I'd have no choice but to fight. Then, a loud crash echoed from outside. It sounded like something had fallen, or been thrown, near the scrap pile. "What the hell was that?" one of the men shouted. "Let's just grab what we can and go," another snapped. The three of them scrambled, grabbing tools, my radio, and even the TV from the corner. Within minutes, they were gone, the van's engine roaring as it sped away. When I finally stepped out from my hiding spot, the garage was a disaster. Tools lay scattered across the floor. Drawers hung open, and the shelves were nearly bare. I sank to the floor, the crowbar slipping from my hands. The fear and adrenaline coursing through me left me shaking, my breath coming in shallow gasps. The next day, I drove into town and bought a gun. I didn't like the idea of having one, but after what happened, I couldn't take any chances. For days, I couldn't shake the feeling that they'd come back. Every creak of the floorboards, every rustle of the wind outside sent me into high alert. I thought I could handle isolation, that I was safe out here in my own little world. But that night changed everything. The nights after the break-in were restless. I started locking every door and window, double-checking every shadow, but no matter how secure I made the house, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. Then came the sounds, the faint, rhythmic thumping from the laundry room. At first, I thought it was my imagination, but as the nights went on, the noise grew louder, and one night, as I opened the door to investigate, I saw it, the crawl space hatch. It was ajar, the lock broken. My blood ran cold. Whatever terror I thought I'd left behind was only just beginning. Story 2. The hike with Sherwood. It's strange how small decisions can spiral into something much bigger. For me, it started with an ad for a washing machine. My old machine had finally died, and I wasn't keen on hauling my laundry to a laundromat every week. The ad on Craigslist seemed like a steal, a lightly used washer at half the retail price. But there was a catch. I had no way to pick it up. That's where Sherwood came in. I'd met him only a month before through a mutual friend. Sherwood was the kind of person who didn't draw much attention. Soft-spoken, polite, and a little socially awkward. When I casually mentioned my predicament in our group chat, he immediately offered to help. "I've got a truck," he said, "and I know how to hook up washers. It's no big deal." At the time, I thought it was a kind gesture, maybe even overly generous for someone I barely knew. But Sherwood insisted, and after some reluctance, I agreed. True to his word, Sherwood showed up bright and early on Saturday morning, his truck already running. The trip to pick up the washer was uneventful, filled with light conversation about work and our favorite TV shows. If I'm honest, I felt a bit guilty about making him go out of his way. So I offered to pay him for his time and gas. He waved it off with a grin. "Nah, don't worry about it." But, he paused, his expression thoughtful. "How about you come on a hike with me sometime? Call it even." It was such a simple request that I didn't think twice before agreeing. Sherwood seemed harmless, and a hike sounded like a fun way to repay his kindness. The day of the hike came a few weeks later. Sherwood texted me early in the morning, asking if I was still up for it. I hesitated for a moment, feeling a flicker of unease I couldn't quite place, but I brushed it off and replied, "Sure, let's do it." He picked me up an hour later, his truck rumbling softly as we made our way out of the city. The trail Sherwood had chosen was a little-known path about an hour's drive away, tucked deep into the woods. "You're gonna love it," he said as we pulled into the parking lot. "Hardly anyone comes out here. It's like having the whole forest to yourself." The parking lot was nearly empty, save for a couple of cars. The isolation didn't bother me at first. In fact, it felt refreshing, a chance to disconnect from the noise of the world and enjoy nature. We set off down the trail, Sherwood leading the way with a small backpack slung over his shoulder. The first stretch of the hike was beautiful, the forest alive with birdsong and the gentle rustle of leaves in the breeze. But as we ventured deeper, the trail grew narrower, the trees closing in around us. The sunlight filtered through the canopy in fragmented beams, casting strange shadows on the forest floor. About an hour in, Sherwood stopped abruptly. "There's a spot I want to show you," he said, glancing back at me. "What kind of spot?" I asked, already feeling a twinge of apprehension. "It's hard to explain," he said with a small smile. "You'll have to see it for yourself." He pointed to a faint trail that veered off the main path, barely visible through the underbrush. "Are we allowed to go off trail?" I asked, trying to keep my tone light. "Of course," Sherwood said, already stepping off the path. "Trust me, it's worth it." Something about his tone made me hesitate, but I didn't want to seem rude or ungrateful. Against my better judgment, I followed him. The detour took us deeper into the woods, the trees growing denser with each step. The air grew cooler, and the sounds of the forest seemed to fade, replaced by an almost oppressive silence. "Are we almost there?" I asked after what felt like an eternity. "Just a little farther," Sherwood said, his voice calm and measured. The clearing came into view suddenly, as if the forest had been holding its breath and finally exhaled. The space was small, surrounded by towering trees that seemed to form a natural wall. At first, I didn't notice it. My eyes were drawn to the sunlight streaming through the branches, the way it illuminated the grass in golden hues. But then I saw it, a shape lying on the ground, partially obscured by leaves and debris. "What's that?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Sherwood didn't answer. He stepped forward, his movements slow and deliberate, My stomach churned as I followed his gaze. It was a body. The figure was face down, the clothes dirty and torn. A nauseating smell hung in the air, sharp and cloying. "Oh my God," I whispered, taking a step back. Sherwood didn't flinch. He stood there, hands in his pockets, staring at the body with an expression I couldn't quite place. "We need to call the police," I stammered, fumbling for my phone. "No signal out here," Sherwood said calmly. His composure was unnerving. "What do you think happened?" I asked, my voice trembling. Sherwood shrugged. "Could be anything. Maybe they got lost. Or maybe," he trailed off, his eyes narrowing as he studied the body. "Maybe what?" I pressed, my fear mounting. "Maybe someone wanted him to be found," he said, his tone unsettlingly casual. A chill ran down my spine. "We need to leave," I said, my voice firmer now. "We have to report this." "Relax," Sherwood said, turning to face me. "It's not like they're going anywhere." I felt my pulse quicken. Every instinct screamed at me to run. But I couldn't shake the fear that if I turned my back on him, I might end up like the person lying in the clearing. As we made our way back to the main path, I kept my distance from Sherwood, watching his every move. My mind raced, trying to piece together his behavior. Then, up ahead, I saw someone, a lone hiker walking toward us. Relief washed over me like a tidal wave. "Hey," I called out, waving frantically. The man stopped, looking startled. "Everything okay?" he asked. "Could you walk with us back to the parking lot?" I asked quickly. "We, got a little turned around." The man hesitated, clearly confused by my urgency, but eventually nodded. Sherwood didn't protest. He fell silent, trailing a few steps behind as we walked. When we reached the parking lot, I turned to Sherwood, forcing a smile. "Thanks for the hike," I said, "but I think I'll drive myself home." He didn't argue. He simply nodded, his expression unreadable, and got into his truck. As soon as I got home, I called the police and reported what I'd seen. They questioned me for hours, asking about Sherwood, the trail, and every detail I could remember. A few days later, they found the body and identified it as a missing person. The case was ruled a homicide, but there was no evidence linking Sherwood to the crime. He texted me a few times after that, asking if I wanted to go on another hike. I ignored him. Even now, I can't shake the feeling that Sherwood knew more than he let on. The way he led me to that clearing, his calm reaction to the body, it all felt too deliberate. Was he just in the wrong place at the wrong time? Or was there something darker beneath his quiet exterior? I'll never know for sure. But I do know one thing. I'll never go hiking with a stranger again. After that, I thought I'd learned my lesson about trusting people. But nothing could have prepared me for what happened next. Because sometimes, the danger doesn't come in subtle hints or uneasy feelings. Sometimes, it blindsides you in the form of raw, brutal violence. And the night I was ambushed by a gang changed everything. Story 3, The Gang Attack. When you're a teenager, the world feels like a place filled with endless opportunities for fun, adventure, and the occasional reckless decision. That was exactly the mindset I had when I agreed to meet up with a guy the first barely knew to play basketball. I'd seen him around the neighborhood, a friendly enough kid with an easygoing demeanor. He approached me one afternoon while I was walking home, saying he'd noticed me shooting hoops in my driveway. He mentioned he often played at a court a few blocks over and suggested we play a game sometime. It seemed innocent enough. I gave him my number, and a week later, I got a text from him asking if I wanted to meet up. He mentioned bringing some friends and asked if I could do the same. It sounded like a good way to blow off some steam after school. So I agreed. The day started off like any other. I called up 2 of my closest friends, Jake and Marcus, and told them about the game. We grabbed a basketball, packed some water bottles, and headed out in Marcus's old beat-up car. The court was a little out of our usual neighborhood, but it wasn't far enough to raise any red flags. The area wasn't great, but it wasn't terrible either, just the kind of place you didn't stick around in after dark. We parked the car and walked toward the court, joking and laughing as the afternoon sun beat down on us. My new friend was already there, leaning against the chain-link fence with a few other guys. They looked a little older than us, rougher around the edges, but nothing about them immediately screamed danger. "Glad you made it," he said with a grin. "You bring the stuff?" I paused, confused. "What stuff?" "You know," he said, lowering his voice. "Weed." I felt a small knot of unease form in my stomach. He'd casually mentioned smoking when we first talked, but I didn't think he was serious. No, I said. I thought we were just playing ball." His grin didn't falter, but there was a flicker of something in his eyes, disappointment. "Maybe, or annoyance. No big deal," he said, pushing off the fence. "Let's get started." We hadn't even started warming up when things took a turn. One of the guys from his group, the tallest, with a shaved head and a jagged scar running down his cheek, pulled a gun out of his waistband. "All right," he said, his voice cold and commanding. Empty your pockets. Time seemed to freeze. My mind struggled to process what was happening. This wasn't a joke. This wasn't some weird initiation ritual. This was a robbery. Jake and Marcus froze beside me, their eyes wide with fear. Come on, now, the guy barked, waving the gun toward us. Don't make this harder than it needs to be. Another man stepped forward, yanking Marcus's wallet out of his pocket. Jake tried to back away, but someone grabbed him by the collar and threw him to the ground. I was so focused on what was happening to them that I didn't see the third guy until it was too late. He grabbed me from behind, twisting my arm painfully as he shoved me against the fence. Don't move, he growled, pressing something cold and hard against the back of my head. What followed was chaos. They didn't just rob us, they brutalized us. One of them hit Marcus across the face with the butt of his gun, sending him sprawling to the ground. Jake was kicked repeatedly as he tried to crawl away, his cries of pain echoing in my ears. The guy holding me slammed my head into the fence, the metal cutting into my skin. Blood dripped down my face, stinging my eyes as I struggled to stay conscious. Where's your phone? He demanded, shaking me. I don't have it. I lied, my voice trembling. He didn't believe me. He reached into my pocket, yanking out my phone before throwing me to the ground. That's what I thought, he muttered, stepping over me as I gasped for air. It felt like hours, but the whole thing couldn't have lasted more than a few minutes. They stripped us of everything. Wallets, phones, even Marcus's car keys. As they walked away, one of them turned back and smirked. Thanks for the donations, boys. We were left battered and broken on the court, the afternoon sun mocking us with its warmth. Marcus was the first to move, dragging himself to his feet despite a gash on his forehead that was bleeding profusely. Jake lay curled on his side, groaning in pain. I sat up slowly, every inch of my body aching. We managed to limp to a nearby gas station, where the clerk's jaw dropped when he saw us. He handed us a phone, and Marcus called the police while I tried to clean myself up in the bathroom. By the time the cops arrived, I was too numb to feel anything but exhaustion. They took our statements, but their expressions told me everything I needed to know. This wasn't the first time something like this had happened. And it wouldn't be the last. 2 weeks later, a detective showed up at my house. We traced your phone, he said, flipping open a notepad. It was used in connection with a robbery, another one. My stomach dropped. What do you mean? He explained that the gang had continued their spree, using stolen phones to set up meetings with other victims. The most recent incident had ended in tragedy. A man was shot and killed when he refused to hand over his wallet. I felt sick. I'd warned the police about how violent they were, but it hadn't been enough. After that, I couldn't shake the paranoia. Every time I left the house, I felt like someone was watching me. The sound of footsteps behind me made my heart race, and the sight of a group of strangers made me break out in a cold sweat. I stopped playing basketball. I stopped trusting people. The world no longer felt like a place of opportunity. It felt like a minefield, ready to explode at any moment. I thought I'd seen the worst the world had to offer, but sometimes, the most unsettling dangers aren't the ones that leave you bleeding in the street. Sometimes, they're the ones that worm their way into your life, smiling all the while. That's how I met her, the squatter fiancé. A stranger who didn't just take what wasn't hers, but made you feel like she had every right to it. And once she was in, getting her out was a nightmare all its own. I never did find out what they were looking for. Maybe they thought I had cash hidden away. Maybe they were searching for something else, something they knew was inside the wreck of a car they dumped in my garage. But here's what still keeps me up at night. What made them leave so suddenly? That crash near the scrap pile. That sound that sent them scrambling. I never figured out what caused it. When I checked the next morning, nothing had fallen. Nothing was out of place. It was as if something, or someone, had made that noise on purpose. Maybe I was lucky. Maybe something scared them off before they could do worse. Or maybe whatever they were looking for found them first. What do you think was in that car? And if you were in my place, would you have done anything differently? Let me know in the comments. And if you love hearing terrifying stories like this, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to Wolf Tells. Because out here, in the dark corners of reality, the scariest stories are the ones that are true.